Welcome back to Turpentine VC, the podcast where we discuss the art and science of building successful venture firms, VC to VC. This week, we're bringing you the second episode of This Won't Last, the newest show from Turpentine. Up ahead, they share a rare anecdote about the first venture investment into OpenAI, lay out the bull and bear case for the leading AI companies, and discuss regulatory chess games at play in American politics. Here's Keith Rabois, Logan Bartlett, Kevin Ryan, and Zach Weinberg.
All right, should we do it? We made it 2. We're 2 in now, guys, or I guess we'll see if we make it through this episode in totality. But thanks for running it back and doing a second one. I don't know what Vegas had the line at for us making it to number 2. I think it was like, I don't know, plus 250 to make it to episode 2. So here we are, beating the odds once again.
It's like the Knicks championship odds at this point.
Which actually went from plus 900 down to plus 700 with the cat news. So we can take that up offline, but.
Yeah, every New York Knicks fan I know is kind of like, it's like that cautious optimism. Like, oh, this looks good. But as a Knicks fan, you don't want to believe. So
they gave up too much.
It's really only DDV, though. I mean, I don't know.
First round draft choice.
Randall was kind of an expiring at this point, so it seemed like he wasn't going to re-sign. But I'm sure this is why everyone's here to hear us talk NBA basketball.
Well, you have accidentally assembled 4 Knicks fans.
I know. That's actually we tried to come up with a name, and that's actually what we should have probably gone with, just like 4 Knicks fans. Yeah. Well, good. So I guess last night, we're recording this on Thursday morning, the OpenAI round officially announced. Keith, you guys have been longtime investors. I think actually the first investors at KB, right? Like at the $1 billion round?
KB was the only institutional investor when OpenAI started.
And when it started, when it had a commercial entity, right? Originally, it was kind of funded as a nonprofit.
Correct. But about 2 years in, it was very obvious that this was going to consume significant capital. And the best way to motivate and align the right people and build a company for real was to raise venture capital as well as convert into a pseudo-profitable entity.
And that was a $1 billion pre-round, if I remember correctly.
I think it was 500 million from recollection.
Okay, got it.
I think it was 500 or 550 posts.
And that was before it was in vogue just to give $500 million valuations to AI companies too. So, yeah.
Oh no, it was considered insane. It was like, I remember I was still at KB when we were investing, and it was.
You were at KB when you were investing, or Founders Fund when you were investing?
I was at KB.
Wow.
So the node was the champion, but I was like this sort of second person supporting this, and everybody else thought it was crazy. But it was a no-brainer investment. It was just, did the terms make sense? Like, should we invest in OpenAI at some valuation? 100% no-brainer. What was not obvious is 50 million at 500 posts.
And I'm actually curious, I guess, I've never heard this version of events and not really what I meant to dive into off the top. Why did you think it was a no-brainer at the time? It sort of seems both one of the most forward-looking investments that have happened in the last decade and also presumably one of the crazier ones, at least it seemed from the outside in, but it sounds like it was consensus.
There are three key components. First of all, the node had been on the AI wave for 15 years. He's writing pieces. You can Google them about the future of healthcare is AI driven, no doctors need AI since like 2009 or 10. So, thesis driven investment, on brand, et cetera. Secondly, the firms had a long-standing relationship with Sam Altman, from Dino to David to me. Obviously, I think many people know that Sam officiated my wedding. So we obviously wanted to support Sam in almost anything he would do. And then third is, even from the very, very beginning, you could identify the core talent. The way one of my partners is an AI expert, and the way Sven described this at the time in like 2017 or 18 was, other than DeepMind, there is no constellation of talent that's anything like the OpenAI core team. So betting on density of talent is always a good thing as a seed investment, not necessarily at 500 million posts. And take a zero off and it would have been a no-brainer.
And what was the decision at the time on the 500? I mean, like, how did you guys ultimately get your head around Series A or whatever it was at that price?
Well, so, KB is usually very price disciplined. It'll off like by an order of magnitude or more from our standard investment philosophy. So that was the only debate, is how much do you stretch? And there were good reasons. The company was going to consume capital. So it wasn't just an artificial demand of, we can extort investors, so we'll take this price at, some high price, which occasionally you see and usually barf on. It was like, there's a lot of reasons why the company to succeed and have any inflection traction will need real capital. And so that was the market price. And we were kind of in or out. And the big questions were like, how much did you commercialize this? How much was the team committed to commercializing this? And knowing Sam really well, David had worked with Sam before, I'd worked with Sam before, Vinod knew him. We really believe that Sam has a really strong commercial mind and that ultimately he would make money for investors. It was basically that point blank a conversation. Sam, are you going to make money for investors? Yes, I am. Okay, we all believed it. And, the rest is history.
Wow.
What was there from like a product demo perspective?
Nothing.
Anything?
It was a team, but getting top tier AI researchers in a constellation of 5 to 15 of them was unprecedented at that time. It's still true today, by the way. These companies that you see get funded at ridiculous prices are basically just a constellation of 5 to 15 people where 3 or 4 of them are co-authors on 3 or 4 different papers, and they can raise money at almost any price.
Yeah, and there is such a shortage of talent. I mean, look, there must be jobs for literally 25 times more AI PhDs than there were 7 years ago, and we don't have 25 times more. I've never seen a shortage of talent in 30 years as I've seen in this space now. But how many of those original people are still there, Keith?
I haven't counted. Obviously, a few left very recently, although, sometimes people are unfair and uncharitable. Most of those people were there for between 6.5 and 9 years, which is a pretty long time. I haven't been at many companies that long in my life either. So I think sometimes people can criticize from afar, but 8 years is a pretty damn strong commitment by anybody to any one entity.
Well, also, like, if you're there from the beginning and they're allowing secondary sales in these rounds, which I assume they are at some level, I mean, you've got people taking tens of millions of dollars, if not more, off the table. It makes sense they want to go try their own thing.
Well, also people, everybody on this call knows building a company from scratch is really difficult, painful. There's a lot of sacrifices involved. 6 to 10 years of sacrifices is a lot of sacrifices for family, for hobbies, for friends. So, it's totally reasonable for people to decide that after 5 to 10 years, they want to do other things and prioritize other things in their lives. That's very normal.
How many of these like AI companies do you think really actually need that like foundational talent, like the folks who can do the ground up model building and infrastructure versus the investors kind of like think they need the talent, but the reality is they're more like a downstream customer of an OpenAI?
It depends on what the companies aspire to do. I think the application level, I don't think you really need that talent. This is me speaking for myself. I think some of my partners who are AI forward would still push the envelope there. But if you're really competing on the foundational level, absolutely, you've got to have world-class talent that can compete with OpenAI, can compete with Google's various things, it can compete with, super safe intelligence. Those are going to be rare. So it depends where in the stack kind of you're going to compete, in my view.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of specialized companies that really need skill in that area. I have one company in material science, and so we need AI and involvement with material science, and there's only so many people in the world that you can get. But I've never seen salaries and payment. I mean, my understanding is that the amount that OpenAI is paying people and some others is just, sometimes 5 times, 10 times more than good engineers were getting 5 years ago. And other companies just aren't going to be able to afford that.
I mean, you're talking, I assume 7-figure.
Yeah, no, but there's sort of
more.
There's sort of like a BATNA type situation to it now where all these folks are also being offered to go start their own business. Like Ilya can go raise at $1 billion pre, I think it was billion pre, maybe I'm wrong, without, the team or necessarily the idea totally fleshed out in its entirety. And he can own whatever it is, 80% of that company, right? And so the alternatives here, not to mention you have, we talked about it last time, but the acqui-hires to get the folks from Adept or Character or whatever you want to call that back to the business. There's clearly like this power law of talent. And it's not just like having someone that knows AI. It's like if you're one of the top 15, 25 people, like your value is almost uncapped to a big company.
Well, we were talking, about us being Knicks fans. It's a little bit like the NBA. There hasn't been a team, I think, that's won an NBA championship without 2 superstars. I defined as maybe the top 2 of the top 20 players in the league since 1998 when Detroit did it. So I think there's a bit of this that's true in any field. If you're going to compete on some dimension in a power law business, you may need 1 or 2 people that are in the top 20 in that field to have a top.
And I think it's also proving that we have historically underpaid our best engineers. And all of us would have said 10 years ago that your best engineers are much, much, much better than your average engineers. And we paid them 50% more, sometimes 100% more, when in fact, they almost should be paid infinitely more because they will make the difference and make the company.
Well, in drawing the parallels to the NBA, that's actually kind of what has happened, where you have folks now making 60, 65, $70 million, like 35% of the salary cap or whatever it is. And the middle has been really hollowed out, right? No one's making, I mean, it's very little, the number of people that are signing new contracts today for like 15 or 20. It's sort of like you're getting single digits or you're getting, north of 30, 35, 40.
The interesting question is like, what actually happens to engineering salaries, not in like the AI layer, but just at like the application layer? Because theoretically, being a great engineer is no longer that difficult as these models kind of get better and better. I wonder where you see like the middle to the NBA analogy end up, because you might not need nearly as many people who are actually exceptional.
Agreed. And I think even the NBA is not the perfect example because it's not a free market. We have socialized, our sports systems for better or worse. With the Premier League, they don't have salary caps really. And so people make an extraordinary amount of money.
What is the high end, like what the highest person in a Premier League team, are they making 50% of the total dollars going to the salary?
I don't think they get to 50%. And here's what makes it unusual is that they have these transfer fees too that you have to pay. So it's not the same. It's not a free market system in its own way either. But yeah, they're making a lot more than the NBA players.
Yeah.
The best players.
As you think about, the talent departure component of all of this, and Keith, realizing that people have been there for a long time, I guess, and you maybe are too close to the situation to totally comment on this, although people put in long journeys to your point. I guess, Zach or Kevin, do you guys have any view on some of the recency of people leaving, or I don't know, any perspective on what you...
I think we've covered it. It still is unusual because if you have unvested shares, because some of these people got shares, even if they got reloaded, they got 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and presumably they're vesting a staggering amount of money. Most large companies don't lose those people as many times as they have here. But to Keith's point, 20 years ago, no one could walk out the door and have a $500 million, pre-money valuation put in front of them. I've never seen that. Just one last point there is that when you think that Apple went public and raised $9 million at the IPO, and my first company in W98, we raised, like 60 million, which was perceived as a very big IPO. That it's orders of magnitude bigger in capital that is still coming. That it's not about inflation. It's the size of the markets. And we've all underestimated how big this can be.
It also depends like when in the maturity of these companies are people leaving, right? You're leaving OpenAI 7 years in, you've vested a material percentage, you've had secondary, you have probably tens of millions of dollars in the bank, like literally in cash. I don't view that as a commentary on the company, much more just like these people want to try something new and the market for them is insane. If you see people leaving after 2 years and 3 years, I would be concerned for that business. It's a really negative signal. But I don't view the OpenAI departures as anything besides kind of natural capitalism at work.
There's also one positive, and I haven't talked to insiders about this, but AI is a freshly developing field. Like every week, there's new developments. And if you're running a company in a highly emergent field, you may want some turnover, actually more than a typical tech company, because you want to give up and coming talent the ability to, sort of spread their wings and have more opportunities. Like the people who actually built OpenAI may no longer be as cutting edge as where, the research is today. So there's some freshness that's possibly a good thing for OpenAI because of the speed of innovation in their field.
One of the business of OpenAI, there's been some reporting over the course of the last couple of weeks on where the business currently sits. And I'll quote some numbers from a gentleman today did a good job pulling together, kind of piecing together the different sources from Bloomberg. And I think, CNBC reported some of this stuff. Wall Street Journal, I think, reported some. But it sounds like roughly the numbers that he had, and we'll share this on screen for folks that are watching along, but roughly the run rate of OpenAI ending 23 at 1.6 billion, ending 24, his estimates are between 5 and 5.2, and getting to a revenue number of 11.6 at the end of 2025. I think about 75% of this, again, in his estimates for the end of 24 is ChatGPT related subscriptions. So just staggering numbers, I guess, in terms of the absolute quantum. And it sort of makes the $150 billion valuation in the grand scheme of growth rates. It's actually, I think, cheaper than some of the rounds that happened around Facebook or some of the other businesses. Now, we can talk about cost of capital and burn rates and all of that stuff. But I was curious, as some of those numbers were reported out, anyone have any perspective on just like the staggering numbers that we're sort of seeing in that business?
I mean, they're unprecedented in the history of the world. So, it's remarkable. It's remarkable. I remember, way back when someone was saying that no one had reached $1 billion in 5 years. That was like 20 years ago of revenue. And so these numbers do justify large numbers. I think you should add one more factor. There's a lot of risk because as we could debate, do they really have a sustainable advantage? That's not clear yet, but it may be. I think it was a very bold move, that Thrive led that round, put in a lot of money. And I think it's impressive. That's what VCs are supposed to do, which is take some serious risk.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Managing company expenses doesn't have to be a hassle. You can effortlessly streamline the entire expense management process, from receipt capture to approval routing and reimbursements, in a single solution. Enter Rippling Spend, the revolutionary platform trusted by thousands of businesses to take control of their finances. Backed by top investors and boasting over $1 billion in funding, they're dedicated to providing exceptional value to their customers. Here's how it works. An employee submits a lunch receipt via their Rippling app, and AI instantly turns it into an expense report, checking for policy compliance in real time to auto-approve or send directly to the approver based on your org chart. No more chasing receipts or manually routing approvals. Want to take it a step further? Automate your corporate card management with Rippling as well. You can automatically issue cards to employees with preset limits and specific policies, such as managers with a $50 team lunch limit. The rest is auto-rejected at the point of transaction. Then, every transaction syncs with your accounting system in real time. Plus, you earn market-leading rewards on every purchase, rewarding your company for everyday spending, all while closing your books 3 times faster. Ready to transform your company's spending? Sign up for a free demo at rippling.com/turpentine and get 1 month free. That's rippling.com/turpentine. Start your 1 month free trial today. Our sponsor for today's episode is Carta, the end-to-end accounting platform that's purpose-built to power the strategic impact of the fund CFO. For the first time ever, private fund operators can now leverage their very own bespoke software that's designed from the ground up to bring their whole portfolio together, enabling formations, transactions, and distributions to flow seamlessly and accurately. The end result? A remarkably fast and precise platform that empowers better strategic decision-making and delivers transformational insights on demand, timely K1s, holistic fund performance data, and so much more. Come see the new standard in private fund management at carta.com/investors. That's carta.com/investors.
Maybe on the bear case side, which is not about the top line, but about the true margin profile of that revenue and the potential pricing pressure you're seeing. I think it's obviously a fascinating company. I'm not poo-pooing it in any way, but like to critique the valuation for 2 seconds. One, what is the real margin on that revenue, right? Because this is a weird business where your COGS, if you will, doesn't look like a variable cost. It looks like this giant CapEx that you have to spend training the model. And so you're looking at the revenue going like, what's the multiple I should really apply to this? Because if I've got to spend $5 billion a year to generate this revenue on the other side, and that 5 is trending up, not down, what is the actual cash producing opportunity of the business? And I would be very skeptical of like the true margin profile here. The other one I would say is like, you've also got some of the largest balance sheets in the world. In fact, I shouldn't say some of it is the largest balance sheets in the world, except for maybe Apple, coming after your product line. Not necessarily with a better product. There's a lot of like fast following going on. Obviously, OpenAI is in front of, Gemini and others, but those companies can spend a lot of money for a very long time and lose money. Plus, which is like the wild card, is Facebook or Meta, or whatever we're calling them these days, because they're chasing and open sourcing. Right. So now you've got like real competition coming from, the open source world, where you eventually could see like a much cheaper version of this as an enterprise customer. So there's some questions on the revenue quality, in my opinion, and that would be where I'd get scared at like 150 billion. It's clearly a good business. There's clearly something, amazing inside here. It's just the valuation to me, I would be concerned about.
I think if companies are accumulating the human talent, which I think OpenAI is, it gets harder and harder to lose. And if we believe that, AI is going to be very important, I still think it's a pretty good bet. The final thing is I think we're underestimating how much costs will come down, at least per unit, however you want to defend that. I think they'll come down by 90% in the next couple of years, but it'll be competitive. I mean, it's fascinating. We can't, this model, none of us, even OpenAI, don't know what their model is going to look like 5 years from now.
The double-edged sword of this right now, when you compare it to, like, I'm sure all of us lived in different ways, sort of the cloud journey of Amazon and Microsoft and Google, there is more differentiation, at least in my opinion, at the product level here than it seemed to be in the cloud wars. Now, you also have independent companies in the private markets going after this, whereas those were the businesses actually with infinite balance sheets. But I'm curious, how much do you think like the actual, we see this rate of degradation, and we can show a chart on screen of like open source actually catching up with the proprietary models pretty regularly. How much do you think that the actual models themselves will continue to drive the opportunity set for these businesses? And it's actually just a very fast degrading asset every time you do a new training run, something else catches up to it pretty quickly after.
Think about it I would just say from a training data perspective, right? Like, the bigger and more interesting these training data sets get, the models are still going to be extremely expensive to run. I don't know, like, I would question is it really getting cheaper? Maybe it's getting cheaper to run the models, but to train them, I'm actually not convinced it's getting cheaper by any means, because the volume of data you're putting into these models is growing.
Dario from Anthropic actually said he thinks that in 2025, we're going to have a $10 billion model. And Dylan Patel, who's a semiconductor analyst, did a podcast with Darkwesh Patel the other day, and he thought that it might need to be $50 to $100 billion.
And by the way, if you read the analyst reports and you read like what, Satya and others are saying, I mean, they're saying this is like $1 trillion of spend. The other thing that's going on here, I mean, if you look at just Google and Meta for 2 seconds as like the potential, let's call them real long run competitors here, Google's got YouTube. I mean, we probably haven't scratched the surface of like the information that Google can actually feed into these models. Get the largest video data source in the history of mankind by like an order of magnitude. So I don't know if costs are coming down once Google starts to like get YouTube into these training data sets. And Meta's got a similar underlying training data with Instagram data, with Facebook. I mean, I worry if I'm OpenAI of catching these guys because they're not capital constrained. They're unlikely to be infrastructure constrained. And maybe if you squint over a 5 or 10 year period, they actually have a data advantage. Now they're behind today, no question. Right? Like from a quality of product perspective, OpenAI is in front. But like, is that sustainable and how? And, eventually data wins out here. My training data specifically, I think.
Yeah, but if there's one story of the last 30 years, it's that a focused, well-funded startup will beat the large competitor almost every time. I mean, we could have had this call 20 years ago or 15 or 10 about Google and how they're going to win and everything. And frankly, they haven't won in that many things that they haven't purchased other than search.
But we haven't had that in a business model that requires massive CapEx, right? Like I agree in a software concept that makes a lot of sense because you're like constantly tweaking at the application layer. It's not that expensive. But these companies at the foundation layer, they don't look like software companies. If you think about them from an operating perspective, they look more like oil companies, right? They have to drill, they have to build rigs. I mean, there's massive CapEx. And so you're competing in a world where money actually matters and training data size actually matters. So I agree from like a application layer, yes, the small, nimble startup will crush. I'm not convinced that's what these companies really are. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see how it plays out. It's just the money is insane. It's going to be $1 trillion of spend.
My guess is it's not that much because there's diminishing return. If you can look through 10 million emails, at a certain point, 20 million doesn't help that much. Looking through them effectively, cost efficiently, and pulling out the right data is important. But I think they already have access to a lot of data, and there'll be diminishing returns.
But if that's true, just to push on it, if the value of the increment, if we're drawing these curves, right, of like dollars and data in and value out on the other side, if it's true that that's diminishing, I'm not sure it is yet. At least I don't think we've hit that asymptote. But if it is true, then all of a sudden you kind of know the model weights at a certain point. And so if everybody kind of gets to the same model weights, if Google gets the same model weights and Facebook gets the same model weights, well, now the price of these products is going to come down, right? Because you've got Google and Meta who have other business models to monetize it, which is also, in my opinion, a bear case on the OpenAI side, which is like, well, actually, if the training is not as valuable in 5 years, you've got insane competition and a shrinking moat. And so it's kind of like, which one is it?
Think of it as ChatGPT is a consumer app. And users are getting millions, tens of millions of folks are getting trained that is the place to go, that AI is ChatGPT. And so as long as ChatGPT performs on par, the 70% or so of the revenue is consumer pay. So that's not going away. And it doesn't really matter. Open source can't really compete with that. Mark can put some consumer app on top of it, but no one wants to use Facebook anymore. So he's got to build a whole new consumer app on top. Google could try to integrate it in, but then they have the classic incumbents dilemma, blah, 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 blah. So it's not so easy. I think OpenAI, as long as they stay on par with people, has all the consumers, and they're just going to keep addicting consumers to the next wave of technology.
Maybe. It's an interesting argument, but like, think of like existing distribution, right? Like Apple owns the iPhone, folks. Like, so, they'll be in front just in terms of like native to iOS. Obviously, Google's going to stick this. I mean, it's already, I have a Pixel, right? It's like in every app in very stupid ways, by the way, which is clearly like some odd product mandate.
It's one of the worst qualities, by the way, having a Pixel, Zach. Among many worst qualities, this is one that really is frustrating to me.
The actual history is because I used to work at Google for 2 years. They started giving free phones. And at that point, I was like, all right, I'll take the free phone. And I stuck with it, mostly out of spite of all of my friends. But like, I worry about consumer distribution and like the brand, if you will, being like the long run thing, because you have people with billions of eyeballs who are coming after you, both in Meta and Apple and Google, which is going to be like a little tight.
But that's where Kevin's point is really powerful. Over 40 years, it's basically never worked that these people with large distribution platforms, when you can teach a focused vertical app that's really resonating with tens of millions of folks, you don't lose that lead, like basically ever, or it takes decades to lose that lead.
Interestingly, the people I know who use AI the most, if you will, from a consumer perspective, maybe not like in their day-to-day job, have all switched to Perplexity at this point.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about Perplexity, right, is like it sits on multiple models, right? That's kind of like the interesting layer. And so, you've got this like sandwich competition. You got Perplexity and probably 19 Perplexity copycats coming. And then you got the foundational layer people here, and you're like, and who am I competing with if I'm OpenAI? I feel like a very big bear right now on OpenAI. I'm really not. I think it's a great business.
One of the things on the Perplexity point, one, I can pull up some graphs that show on screen here, but their retention curve is actually, and this is publicly available web data, is much, much better for ChatGPT than it is for Perplexity. And I use Perplexity as well, and I pay for it, and I like it quite a bit. But like, there's something going on in the difference in terms of how people use ChatGPT and how people use Perplexity, if only evidenced by the retention curve. One of the things, I mean, this whole point of singular focus, like I get it 100%, and it's never proven true in the course of the internet. But some of the private label brands for Walmart or Costco or whatever it is, like if we sort of go to some of the other more physical, capex intensive, whatever you want to call it, products, I don't know. I mean, I think in the internet, maybe there's some unique qualities to this, but as you draw parallels over the history of time, banks, for example, I don't know if it totally holds.
Well, if you have a monopoly on distribution, which Apple has a 50% monopoly, that is a real advantage. If that makes the difference, and Walmart, has access to supermarkets in a way that other people don't. To date on the internet, we haven't had that constraint, but that is one outlier there. By the way, all the points you're making, Zach, are risks, and it could go any number of ways. But, when we step back, we've seen this movie many times. I mean, why was Google going to win when there were 7 other search engines? It wasn't, frankly, at the time that much better. It was a little bit better. And it was enough of a difference that over time, they just had human talent, they focused, and they had money. They had as much money as they needed. And so far, OpenAI doesn't have a cash problem. we keep thinking they will.
Because just when Google was starting, they were competing with like shithole Yahoo and Excite and, these like kind of rinky-dink competitors.
But no, wait. To be fair, though, a little bit later on, Yahoo was a big company and was public and was bigger and more valuable than they were. I mean, they made an offer to buy the company. So,
well, that's the innovator's dilemma in all of this from Google's standpoint. Zach, I've quoted, I can't believe I'm reattributing it to you here because I could just say it as my own and own it. But that Google does have an opportunity to, I think you said, be like the Americans in World War II, that they have, eventually they can get it right over time. But it does start to get to the core of their business model. And I know Perplexity talks a lot about this, like, the CPMs and the ability to actually change from their existing business. I mean, Zach and Kevin, you guys have lived this world far more than I, but they have a very good existing business, and it's kind of this core innovator's dilemma situation that they're in. Are they really going to, make the hard decisions to get to potentially where they need to go if it's uncertain if it's actually going to land there?
I mean, I hope that they wake up every day and realizing that if you're Google, that this is the first existential threat that I've seen to them in 15 years.
And survey came back, last December, I think, or the founders got more involved in it over that, right?
Yeah, it's hard for us. Yeah, I think the three of us are not convinced that they're working 70 hours a week on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, another way to take your World War II metaphor is I don't think Google has Eisenhower.
Yeah, I mean, when you have $60 billion and you have a 150-foot yacht just to trail the 300-foot yacht in case the 300 one goes wrong, like, I don't know if you're getting in the weeds of, the model building here. So if anything, it might be a distraction because it's like unclear leadership, but it's not. Google is so bad at figuring this. If they're so slow. And so like, that's definitely a bull case. By the way, the other thing I would say on the bull of OpenAI is just like the hype train is so big and so global that even if in 15 years, it turns out this business can't make money, between now and then, it will go public. It will have liquidity. This thing will get bid up in the same way that Tesla got bid up into the hundreds of billions of range just on the story alone. And you'll get your cash out. And I think like that's probably true of anyone putting money in now. Like you're downside protected by the public market is my guess.
And just to add to that, as we mentioned earlier, they are attracting talent. They are getting many, not all, but many of the best people. And we cannot, this is like an oil company. They're getting oil. And if you have oil, it makes the difference.
Question in my head is like, do you see the other players, right? The Anthropics and I guess there's a few others, like, is there space for that?
Well, I think right now, Anthropic sort of one, they're attracting really good talent. Like there's people going over to that business that I think are just really impressive, either ex OpenAI or ex DeepMind or whatever. And so I think they're getting a density of talent over there. I feel like it's an interesting position for them to be in because they are able to serve as kind of the Microsoft Azure to OpenAI's Amazon AWS, like cloud service, where that was the first one that really got going. And then Anthropic's been able to counterposition in some ways. They got into bed with Amazon, whereas OpenAI is in bed with Microsoft. The weird thing there is they are much more beholden to the safety premise than even OpenAI is. And so my understanding is some of the incentives that exist within that company, if you think it's weird with the nonprofit structure and the commercial entity and all of that within OpenAI, it feels like that's gone by the wayside more and more. And I think we're going to see it move to more of a commercial entity. Sam has been rumored to take equity now, and it feels like they're kind of moving in a more capitalistic mandate. But when you're serving two masters as Anthropic might be both from a safety standpoint as well as an AGI standpoint, I think it just makes it hard to make these decisioning trade-offs. So
the safety thing is such bullshit. Like,
completely
you go
agree.
back to like any technology. People are like, I don't know, these newspapers seem unsafe. Like everyone's going to have information. And then the internet is like Wikipedia. People are like, oh, they're going to put bomb recipes on Wikipedia. Like, come on. I mean, it's just, if that's going to be the thing that Anthropic, is anchoring on, it's like, driving 60 miles an hour with the handbrake on, like you're fucked. Like it's just never going to happen. It's just like, there's always these doomsday people in every technical revolution, and they have literally never been right. And so I don't know why we think
to be
this time's
fair,
different.
I mean, even when you get to like some of the people that are really smart on this, I think, and Dario from Anthropic, will say this, and other people, they do think that there's some non-trivial percentage of these things happening. And they've always been wrong because the world hasn't, ended in some catastrophic fashion, right? And eventually, if it does happen, there's no one gets to say, I told you so at that point in time. And so I hear you. It can only be true once at some point. And so there is some survivorship bias that's never happened before. But
no one's denying that there isn't potential risk. That is true. But the idea that we're going to collectively stop developing things for 6 months somehow was one of the dumbest ideas I've heard in a long time. Why? Because we're going to let the Chinese move forward and then we'll be protected by them. I really don't think so.
Yeah, no, I think it's insane. And you see people all across the political spectrum, like Vinod and Kevin, who are more left, me, who's more conservative, realizing the insanity of turning the AI future over to the Chinese. That makes no sense. Secondly, this idea of safety, even if you believe there's some risk, when have the experts ever really been right about the risk profile of future innovation? I'm not sure, ever. And then third is like risk is a relative game. Like you have to think about things we do every day. You drive a car, you take a shower. And yes, it's hard to compare asymmetric and all this stuff, but I mentioned last time on our podcast, electricity never would have been allowed in the modern world. And just think about that. Think about how much poorer we'd all be, literally and figuratively, if we didn't have electricity.
I mean, the risk is ultimately like, do you have bad actors, which are humans? And so, the Chinese thing is such a great way of thinking about it, right? Because they're not going to slow down for AI safety rules. It's just not going to happen. So we might as well control our own destiny. And I do think the good news is in America, we are going to get this right. I mean, maybe California decides to shoot itself in the foot every so often, but overall, I don't really see a material impact here. The Europeans will screw themselves over, guaranteed. They've almost already have. And so it's really just the US and China at this point, and those will be the two winners. And I think it will mostly be US companies at this point. That's what it seems like.
I'll try a simple metaphor, Kevin, and then feel free to add some depth. I think technology is just simply a magic wand. There's a metaphor I learned a long time ago. Magic wand, fix things, scalability, fix things, blah, blah, blah. Just make things happen. And, that's what engineers do, is they use this magic wand and cast spells. Well, just like plots of various movies and books in science fiction and others, bad people steal the magic wand to do things. That's possible with any technology. And AI is somewhat similar, but the goal is not to make the magic wands go away. It's to deprive bad people of the magic wand.
Yeah. And, we should, if you want to feel good about something, the world developed nuclear weapons, 70, 80 years ago. And for the last 60, 70 years, we haven't had a problem. Not that we're not all nervous about it. Not that there isn't a risk all the time. But in general, we've done an extraordinarily good job of managing that. This is easier to manage, I think, than nuclear weapons in 30 countries. But we'll see.
I mean, look, if you're worried about AI safety, you should be as pro-US military as you could possibly be, because that is the single biggest deterrent to bad actors, is the size and scale of our military prowess. And so if you're, put your money where your mouth is. If you're scared of AI, you better be deep in investing in Anduril and others, which actually, in an incredible way, I do think the culture, both in Silicon Valley and just broadly in the United States, has changed. These, AI driven, new military companies are really in vogue. They're growing. They're getting great talent. I think it's an incredible thing for the country, for us to lead in this area. And, that's also another benefit of all of this, is people see the military applications of this technology, and we seem to be leading there as well, which is great.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey everyone, Eric here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js, ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork, billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit ChooseSquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
This is another topic, but 15 years ago, I was partial to trying to reduce the amount that we spent on the military. And over the last 7 years, I've completely reversed on that.
And what's caused that?
Oh, because of the way that Russia and China are acting and will act. And I didn't see threats as visibly at the time, and I underestimated them. And we have real players out there that I think want to do bad things.
We've come a long way. I mean, Project Maven, by the way, Project Maven was only 6 years ago at this point. And I mean, Keith, I don't know if you were at FF at the time when the angel investment or the founding was kind of getting going, but it was very controversial in the Silicon Valley zeitgeist. And I think Palmer and how all that stuff played out within Facebook was still controversial as well. And I don't know, Kevin, I agree with you that it's really shifted. I'm not sure what the linchpin or the watershed moment was that really caused it to shift from, in the zeitgeist.
Well, I wasn't at Founders Fund, but I joined, after the first financing and stuff. The key thesis was a classic Founders Fund move, Peter on down, is find things other people don't believe in or afraid of or ideologically opposed to and invest in them. It's the best way to make money in venture. Works. The problem is it's not easy to do that every year. You can't deploy a whole fund of $1 billion that way. But it's the greatest thing ever. And then eventually they become consensus. And that's what's happened with Anduril and other space or defense-oriented companies. I think the sea change is just as simple as Kevin described it. The world is a dangerous place. And maybe in 2008, people believed in the end of history stuff or, I'll be a little political when Obama dismissed Romney's warning about Russia, like you want your 1980s back. There was a lot of smart, elite people that thought the world was getting safer, not more precarious. And, if anything we've learned over the last 4 or 5 years, definitely the world is a dangerous place full of a lot of evil people. And if good people don't do things, evil people are going to triumph.
When things are nice and easy and good, we forget why they're nice and easy and good. And it takes like a little bit of chaos to remind you like, oh, right, 100 years ago, things were not that great. And it's only kind of like recent times where this stuff is true. It reminds me, not to bring it to the other area, but like it reminds me of the vaccine skeptics where they're like, why do we need these polio vaccines? No one gets polio. And you're like, why the fuck do you think no one gets polio, you idiot? And like, it's just, but calm and safety. And you forget the reason we have these rules and
all it's going to take is polio reemerging for the vaccines to be very in vogue, right? It's going to totally shift the pendulum.
It's not just polio, it's measles. It's, it's like all these things. I mean, we are kind of seeing it in certain subcultures where it does reemerge actually, which is incredibly scary because it can be contagious and especially with young kids.
And puts us all at risk.
Yes.
Which is outrageous.
One of the things, I guess, one of the other topics we kind of had here, and I think I've talked to some of you about this in the past, but is just social media messaging platforms, the right to spread information, misinformation, what the different risks of these platforms actually are. Keith, I'm curious your perspective. I think you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, but like what right do people and these platforms have to, especially in this world of AI, where the deep fakes and all that stuff seem to proliferate at a ever growing rate. What role do you think the platforms themselves should take or the government should take? Are there frameworks that you think make sense to try to?
I think it's actually fairly straightforward and maybe easy. Anything you can publish in a book, you should be able to publish on a platform. And if it's illegal to publish something in a book because it's defamatory or it's obscene, you shouldn't be able to post it on social media. But if you can write a book about it and publish a book and sell a book on Amazon, you should absolutely be able to post that on X or any other social platforms. There's no reason for discriminating against ideas. And so I think we've had principles that eliminate certain kinds of speech for centuries, and it's worked extremely well. And we just should take those same principles and apply them to new platforms.
Does age play a different factor? There's certain things that kids can't buy in a bookstore, but they have access to online. Does that change your thinking?
I can buy that. Again, taking principles that have worked for centuries and applying them to platforms. So age gating things makes lots of logical sense to me because we don't allow them, as you point out, to buy certain kinds of books.
Yeah, we don't allow kids to buy alcohol. We don't allow them to buy cigarettes. At a certain age, we do. Seems to apply in the same route. Yeah, no, I tend to agree. It's just we have some safety rules, ironically, that we've figured out, and just because it's connected to a computer, why is it any different than a book or a newspaper? It should be the same. The interesting challenge to me is just like the rhetoric in regulating these online platforms gets very, very intense very quickly, ironically, probably because of the online platforms. And so, I could easily see state by state, even some very intense regulations that can do some harm. So we will see.
What do you think the answer is? I mean, does it need to be a federal level thing? Do you think you let the states just figure it out?
Well, the states have always regulated defamation. Like the law in New York, for example, is very different actually than the law in some other states around defamation or using people's identities. So we've always had state by state laws around defamation, even obscenity. There's a federal layer because of like the First Amendment the Supreme Court has sort of insisted on. But basically, most of these things have been regulated by states very successfully.
Yeah, except that how does that, I mean, you can't really do this on a state level on the internet.
Well,
because you can control the sale.
Gambling on a state by state basis, right?
Yeah, because that's physical, and they can control book sales at a state by state level in newspapers. But here you can't. I mean, it is a nightmare. I mean, I just think the federal government has to decide, because they can't have a site that can be accessed in 17 states, but not in 33 states.
Well, and talk about regulatory capture.
The federal government thing, like, which really bothers me, if like when we consolidate rulemaking in like one body, is just you lose the like ability to learn from your mistakes or your successes when you stick it at the federal government level. I mean, one of the biggest people complain about it in the US, but what they don't realize is like one of our biggest advantages as a country is states' rights, not because any one state gets everything right, but actually you get like, 50 experiments, right? And we watch California do really stupid things. We go, maybe we shouldn't do those. And then you watch Texas do some really interesting things in terms of like development. You go, those could look real. And you like learn as states make mistakes. And whereas if, depending on which administration is in charge coming up with those rules, I really worry that like you can't change them at the federal level very easily. And I'd almost rather let the states experiment.
But wait, Zach, you're not arguing that we can have different definitions of an article that can be shown, that I need 17 different article versions for 17 different states.
Well, we like to block. Lots of financial services companies, for example, block residents of New Hampshire or Utah or Nebraska from using products. So there is, like in the gaming sites that are online, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Trust me, if you're trying to put in a college football bet and you're in California on a Saturday, let me tell you, they block it.
There is some techniques that we've used in other verticals, to regulate by state, even on the internet.
It does make it, there's a lot of friction. There's a lot of friction it creates, but
Zach, you're pro let states figure this out. We went to dinner, our wives, Zach and I did, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and he pushed the limits of letting states figure out things in healthcare. And it's still a topic in our household. My wife and I debate about how extreme this should go. But there's elements of regulatory capture or incumbent advantage that ends up playing out. Like, and if we're going to regulate these things like utilities, or whatever, financial service entities, maybe we should, but we're sort of deciding that there aren't going to be tons of innovation that comes. If we need to have this article can only exist in North Carolina and that can't exist in New York, it's going to advantage all the incumbents that actually have the resources to deal with all that stuff, right?
And we become Europe where you don't have critical mass. I mean, one of the reasons the US market is so powerful is that it is largely a national market. And I agree with you, Zach, that there are examples we can cite where state innovation has been fantastic. But you saw in healthcare, too, the extraordinary, wastage. I mean, the fact that there's a different driver's license process for South Dakota versus North Dakota, is just waste.
Yeah, I'm not arguing. My take is like, we don't need regs beyond the kind of things Keith was talking about in terms, especially like just for kids in particular. So that's like the best of the ideas. Now, if we're going to introduce bad ideas about, trying to like regulate some speech here, at least the state level one is like the least bad. I really worry about like federal regs in this area because it just stifles innovation. It stifles experimentation. We don't have any clear data, even on the kids thing. Now, I am as having 2 kids. No chance in hell my kids will be allowed to use social media until they basically hate me. But at the same time, like, is the data that shows it's harmful to teenagers truly convincing? If we had real randomized studies, like, no, I don't think so. I mean, you can like logically reason why it makes sense, but that's my fear. It's like, we don't even really know what's harmful.
I think in abstract, you can say it's harmful, but it's compared to what? Like, kids have never been the best, most well-behaved, given freedom to do X things. It's not like I sat home, when I didn't have social media, when I was growing up, and just did exactly what my parents wanted me to. So, when you benchmark against, well, what would kids do back then? I don't know if you want to keep clicking on all these things sometimes. And so I think some of these studies are done in isolation, which is like, oh yeah, this is harmful, compared to you're reading a book, going to the gym, working out, et cetera. Sure. But like, what do kids in practice do when they're 16? A lot of things that are like the best for them.
Zach, just because you have younger kids, now that my oldest is 30, I've decided to let him he can use social media now because I'm an open-minded father and I'm flexible.
Is he allowed to keep the door open when he has, guests yet or no?
But it does kind of come down to what the individual accountability and all this stuff. Like, what is the harm principle in these things? And there's been new studies that have come out in the last couple of weeks around like the implications of legalizing gambling and just the rate of domestic violence that comes out of it, the rate of suicide. And you can kind of use usury laws as examples of like we put in some regulations around, checks and balances and not just saying, okay, well, people can do what they want. And I think the social media data, it sounds like, I don't know, I haven't gone in and studied it, but like what exists at the individual accountability level versus what is, societally beneficial. Seatbelts, I think, I'm glad we don't have people flying out of their window every time we have a car accident anymore. But I'm sure at the time people were arguing that like you're infringing on my right to make my decision. And it's like, well, if you die and you're the income earner in the household and now the state has to take over, and help your kids, I don't know. That feels like a good check against that.
Absolutely. But I do think on the increase in suicide attempts, which is a measurable thing by girls, the impact on girls does appear to be quite significant since the introduction of the iPhone. We can't blame it completely on that, but the timing is, we don't have another explanation for it.
I think it's also like an ethics question. It's kind of like fundamentally, how much do you believe that people should just own their own decisions versus how much does society have a role in making sure you just like don't do the worst things? And the answer to that question will vary based on, I think, like personal beliefs. I don't know if there is a right answer. Like, should people be allowed to gamble away all of their money if they so choose?
It's kind of a harm principle thing, right? I think if we totally judged on harm principle, we would probably ban alcohol. Like, if we just look at the societal implications as someone that drinks and enjoys, but like the negative for overall society, I think you could make a very strong case that like alcohol is more of a net negative to society. But it gets in this situation that we've all agreed that the benefits potentially outweigh that at an individual level.
And gambling for me is certainly a net negative. And I personally I'm not sure it should be banned, but I wouldn't invest in anything and I don't want to encourage it. I don't think it makes the world a better place there. But I think the issue, Zach, is trickier because, we pay for all the problems. So when people are obese or don't wear seatbelts and have accidents, it's not just them. If they just die right away, fine. But when they are in the hospital for 6 months, that's all of us paying insurance for that.
100%. Yeah. And that's where you start to see the externality part of it. But it's like gambling is actually really an interesting one because do we pay for those externalities? Like, clearly get mental health issues and maybe some safety, you could argue. People go a little crazy. It's hard. I struggle with this one because, I like sports and sports gambling can be fun. At the other end of it, like
hitting
clearly
the fifth
it's
leg
harmful.
Of a parlay, that's like nothing. No drug hits that.
You're like watching Monday Night Football and you're like, why do I care about these 0-4 teams playing with, like, I don't care. But so, the gambling part kind of makes it interesting. But yeah, clearly it is harmful. I mean, I think everybody has, I definitely have individual friends of theirs where if you were truly honest, you would tell them like, you probably need to delete FanDuel. Like, it's not good for you.
Well, it's also just effectively a tax on poor people.
Yeah. It's regressive.
When I walk through,
as the lottery is, right? Regressive in all ways.
Yeah. When I walk through the casino or something in Las Vegas and I see people, I feel like you can't afford to lose this money, and you are losing this money.
Yeah. One of the reasons, the impression I always have that gambling is terrible is I grew up in New Jersey and we go down to Atlantic City and there's like no friction to get there. Vegas, in some ways, there's friction to get there. And so adding friction, it's not quite as sad. You go to a casino in Atlantic City when I was growing up, it was incredibly depressing. As soon as you open the door, you're like, this is awful for society because people could just bust there. In Vegas, it takes a little bit more resources to get there before you. And so by putting things online and making it easy and reducing the friction, I feel like we turned everything into Atlantic City.
My image of gambling when I was 12 years old came from James Bond movies. And then you go to Atlantic City and you realize it's not really quite that.
I was in Oklahoma a few weeks ago and like you stop, there's the slot casinos alongside the highway. And I stopped to go to the bathroom while I was driving. And I will tell you, that's like, slots are about as sad as it gets of just people sitting there and, it's all there's been tons of studies on the lights and the stimuli and all that stuff that comes out of it, but it's about as bad as it gets. And again, this comes to individual accountability. Like, if we know that the lights and the handle pull and the noises and all that are really rewiring our brains in some way just to keep going from an addiction standpoint, what role should the government play in that if someone's just going to lose their life savings around it?
I don't think we need to encourage it. Now, people can also, by the way, the four of us can gamble amongst each other if we feel like it, and people have always done that. That generally did not ruin people. If you systematize it, make it easy, then it's going to be much worse.
I mean, look, we've already greenlit the world's largest casino, which is crypto. So, unregulated global casino to invest in shitcoins, basically, and with a few use cases. Yes, I know, stable coin, yada yada.
But not many.
My favorite. I don't know if this is true, so I'm just going to say something, and we'll see if somebody actually fact checks this. But I was told, this is my Trump level. Like, some people are talking.
Many people are saying,
yeah, exactly. One person I know told me that like the number one use case on Solana, terms of like that chain or whatever, like the company that generates the most revenue, is basically like an auto shitcoin generator. Like, that's the biggest customer is like a company where you can go in and like 3 clicks, create your own shitcoin and then like go out and market it. And that's the use. So, we do humans. I mean, we've been gambling for thousands and thousands of years. There's clearly pent up demand here. I don't even know if like regulating sports betting is going to matter because we have many other outlets for this stuff for people.
You're right. I mean, what's the line between Robinhood and DraftKings is it's pretty thin in some ways if you really zoom out and think about what people are actually doing with it. So
I don't think that's true. The makeup and the income level of people doing sports betting or slot machines is different from the people on Robinhood. The average income is not the same. And we're also not opening up Robinhood, slot machines all over. We're not encouraging the people. There is some friction to get there.
I'm more comparing DraftKings to Robinhood. Do you think at that level, I mean, obviously there's been some materiality thresholds of who can make what types of investments. Is that a good thing that we're not giving access to certain people to, I don't know, different financial products? And I guess I agree with you that I'm sure we can find the actual data on the different financial profiles of who uses what, but like, should that actually be a governor that if you're not above a certain net worth, you shouldn't be allowed to do this?
To me, it just depends on how much we're actively encouraging it. Again, no one is saying that Zach and I can't bet on the next football game. So that's fine. The question is, are we giving licenses, by the way, mostly because they essentially bribed politicians, and saying you can, have a certain number. New York State is, I can't remember, having 5 or 7 casino licenses that they are giving out. And is it going to make the state wealthier? Is it going to be better? And I'm not sure it will. I don't think it will at all.
The investment regulation one is always a fascinating, like, this is like the accredited investor status, basically. It's what,
that was the word I was looking for.
Yeah, there's like qualified purchaser, which is the big one, but like accredited investor, I think is like 250K in income over the last 2-3 years, something like that. And if you don't have that, you're essentially like not allowed to invest in most alternative assets, which feels odd and regressive, right?
By the way, I think it's kind of like an airline, like getting onto a plane. I think that's the threshold by which they're supposed to judge you. But like, if they build enough confidence that you can do it, they'll let you on. And so like, I don't know if you guys have ever lost your wallet and tried to get on a plane, but you can kind of do it if you show your checkbook or show some other stuff and let them build the confidence. I think it's the same thing with accredited investor generally, but.
Well, I guess I go back to like, why does this exist? Right. Cause it feels like, oh, we've always had this thing. But if you go back, like the reason for many of these regulations, in particular in the finance industry, is like scams. It was just scam after scam after scam after scam, taking advantage of people who were not as well educated and maybe didn't have as much money. And, this is like brokers calling you, getting you to invest in penny stocks, just like thousands and thousands of different versions of that, scamming poor people essentially in mass. And that's the reason for it. And so the question is like, it goes back to that personal responsibility, like ethical issue of, do you think people should be allowed to get scammed? And at what level? Because clearly there's some harm in limiting their ability to access venture funds and startup investing and stuff like that. But there's also harm in letting them throw their money away, in things that clearly aren't real. I don't know what the right answer is.
I mean, you could draw a through line to this and it's a little bit of an extrapolation, but the lack of companies going public because of the regulatory burden and the financial disclosures and all of that stuff that you need now to be a public company. And the reason we've done that in large part is because people were getting scammed on, companies that were going public. And so you do this thing that in principle sounds great. Who doesn't think that like more disclosures and more accountability in the financial markets, like who's going to argue that that's a bad thing until you see the downstream implications, which is like the lack of IPOs and the fact that all this value is being created in the private markets now that used to be in the public markets. And so there are these externalities that are a little unintended, but with broad implications when you start thinking about that.
And I think last time, Zach, we talked about the fact that the FDA is, so protective that, it costs $500 million to get a drug to market. And in the meantime, those people die who didn't get that drug. And maybe some more drugs should get to market. So we are overly careful in some areas.
Yeah, that one is always so hard because a lot of what the FDA is really tasked with at the end of the day is safety, right? It's looking out for populations who may have like a safety issue on a drug they don't fully understand. And the challenge in safety in healthcare, maybe a longer conversation for another day, is sometimes it takes a long time to see those safety issues appear in human beings. And so when people talk about like the FDA being really slow and, these like large safety requirements, you need X hundreds of people in a trial, sometimes more, depending on what you're doing. And you can critique it in like being ultra conservative. Like, sure, it is ultra conservative, but part of the reason for that is you don't see rare side effects in human beings for sometimes could be months or even years. And so like, where's the line for what we're willing to tolerate from a safety perspective? It also varies by disease, right? So it depends on, our tolerance for side effects obviously are higher in oncology and cancer than they are in, dermatitis. It's so hard to say like what's right and what's wrong in those areas. Because I think a lot of it comes down to like, it's that question of like, would you kill one person to save a million? I would, but I don't think a lot of people would, and so it's like, what is your ethics? And that's really tough.
And don't forget, we're not killing one. We're running the risk that someone will die at some point in return for that. And yeah, look, government has to make these decisions all the time, and we do make them. We're just trying to decide, and over time we move that line. But right now that line's overly conservative, I think, on the FDA side. I think we're getting overly lax on the gambling side. Yeah, but everyone has their own, opinion. On
the regulatory side, we just saw this in the sickle cell med that Pfizer just pulled. So Pfizer spent $5.4 billion buying this company that develops really interesting therapeutic for sickle cell. And there were these longer term studies that took a while to read out, which I'll paraphrase essentially as saying there was a higher chance of death in some patients than the control group, right? So there were, there's benefits to the disease in terms of like pain reduction and things like that, but also you have a higher chance of death. And so so Pfizer pulled the whole thing, right? Which was actually a Pfizer choice, not a regulatory decision. And I was talking to my co-founders of like, this doesn't make any sense because ultimately, isn't this a choice that the patient and their doctor could make, which is, you understand the risks. You say, look, you might die X% chance higher, but also there's these benefits of this drug. Like you make the call. And that to me would have been the right decision from like an ethics standpoint of, back to like personal responsibility. Now, what my co-founders told me, which I thought was really interesting, is like, oh, they're pulling it because of lawsuits. And that's actually like the thing that they're worried about is even with all the disclosures and all the informed consents and everything that you would have to put in place to allow people to get on this drug, that the court system is going to kill you. And there'll be a $30 billion judgment.
Yeah, I thought that stuff was all pretty preempted. I mean, there's exceptions, but I thought like for the most part, you can get preempted away litigation risk.
My impression, with not being an expert on the litigation side, I mean, you've got Johnson & Johnson still dealing with the baby powder lawsuits, 30 years later. Look, the drug has its problems. I want to be very clear, right? Like this is not a perfect drug by any means. I'm only using it as an example of where even that litigation side of things, plays a role in the conservative nature of some of these companies. So this is the question of harm.
I mean, you can fix that by statute if you wanted to.
How do you think about like the harm principle versus individual accountability and responsibility, I guess, across, I don't know, we've talked about gambling, we've talked about stock market, we've talked about FDA.
Great question, because I tend to believe in individual responsibility, period. I'm not a big collective action kind of person. I sort of the Margaret Thatcher school of the world of society's like a fake concept. So that said, I'm also pretty clearly believe that there's things that are bad for people and probably default to mostly leaving individual accountability in place. The problem is as we subsidize healthcare and subsidize other things, you're asking other people to pay for poor decision making. And that's when you run into this challenge of if you had to bear the cost of all your poor decisions, you get less poor decisions. But we, for other reasons, decide that we're not going to force you to go bankrupt, or we're not going to force you to not get access to healthcare because you made stupid decisions. But like a lot of healthcare costs are people making stupid decisions, but we subsidize it with, insurance. And as long as you're asking other people to pay, I don't think you get an unfettered right to make stupid decisions. So maybe if you wanted to waive other people paying, period, maybe you get the right to have unfettered decisions. There's probably some calibration there where you can opt in. And this is one of the reasons why I think celebrities are so bad for pop culture. Pop culture celebrities are bad. They're usually typically wealthy and they make a lot of dumb decisions, but they have a buffer. They have an insurance buffer. They have money so they can deal with some of the consequences themselves. Normal people follow the behavior without that buffer, economic or otherwise, jobs, et cetera. They lose a paycheck, they're out of work. The family starves. And so I think we need to think about if you're going to take social fabric insurance of any kind, you may lose some degrees of freedom on your individual responsibility. And that probably is a net economic trade.
There's also a question of like how informed can the like typical person be, right? Like I would make the argument, you get in a car without a seatbelt, you kind of understand the risk you're taking. You drive a bike without a helmet, you kind of understand the risk you're taking. You gamble, you probably should understand. These are not like complicated concepts. You take a drug that has a 1% chance of a material side effect. I'm not sure people really understand what that means from a risk standpoint. We are bad at statistics. We are bad at percentages. Like we're bad at short-term, long-term trade-offs as like human beings. And so it's also like, how possible is it for people to truly understand these individual risks? And that is hard to say.
Well, that's why the do your own research argument at different times is just like, it's really opaque and hard to understand as you get into fields that are, one, I agree with you, the internalization of probabilities, we're just terrible at it as a species. It's just really hard to think that through. But then two, especially as you get into some of these more esoteric areas, it's hard to do your own research. But then you end up with, I mean, we don't need to go down this whole rabbit hole, but the COVID vaccine thing and how all of that's played out. And I mean, that's obviously frayed society in different ways with people trying to do their own research or pushing back.
It's just, they're not capable of doing it. I mean, this is why you get a PhD or an MD and you spend years and years in school. And I'm not saying they're perfect by any means.
I would totally disagree with that. Like, for unfortunate reasons, I've had a master cardiology for myself. And the good news is I have access to 6 of the top 10 cardiologists in the United States, but I've had to do all the work. And none of the 6 agree, by the way. So these are the six of the top 10 ranked cardiologists. They don't even agree on the test I should take. So, I've spent like a decade now, or 8 years, kind of mastering cardiology because I needed to figure out what should I do or not do. Should I be concerned, not concerned, take this test, take this procedure, whatever. And the more you dig into healthcare, the more you find out this is true. So I had a colleague of mine who worked for Square. He has had cancer 8 times, survived, which is miraculous, just alone, at like 30 some odd years old. He was on the precipice of dying like several times. He's been told that he has no future. And he had to do his own research. And once or twice, he pulled off a miracle, like true miracle, where like one time during the middle of COVID, he was told that there is no hope. And he fortunately had made some money at Square, so he funded a prize for anybody in the globe who could tell him what to do. Turns out he found something. He had actually literally mailed his blood samples to 20 different labs because no one during COVID would actually do the work for him. So I've just seen in cancer and cardiology, which are some of the more complicated parts of healthcare, that people doing their own research will outperform a traditional expert. Now, fortunately, my friend Kyle and I, have the resources to do this. But so it's true that not everybody can do this. But the outcome would have been completely different for both of us if we just took for granted what the first doctor we ran into told us to do.
Well, the challenge in healthcare is like, there's many things we just simply don't understand from like a biology standpoint, right? Like, it is naturally imprecise. I mean, we barely understand, what causes cancer in the first place. Like, so it's not surprising to me that there are edge cases for sure where you should go figure it out. Now, when I think it comes down to like, what does do your own research mean? Like, yes, you should seek multiple opinions. Yes, you should go talk to lots of experts. You should kind of like push the limit. The other challenge, by the way, in healthcare is obviously like your doctor doesn't get paid any differently based on your outcome in general cases. So there isn't a full incentive for them to get all of this right. So I think the idea of like, I have an issue, the system isn't solving it, I need to go figure out, what I could do is totally rational and reasonable. It's the ones where it's like, well, hey, we have like layers of published research about this specific decision or this specific drug or this specific, clinical situation. And then everybody goes, I'm going to go read like Facebook comments. And that's the part.
You're still trusting experts in this example. Right.
My example, yes. Kyle, my cancer friend's example, not really. He really had to push the envelope beyond what a lot of experts, but he did find some experts who helped navigate. I can think of some examples as well that the experts were totally wrong. Like in cancer, you want to read a great book, read Breakthrough. The experts in cancer were totally wrong. Now it's been consensus. The people pioneering that research had none of the traditional background. They've all now won Nobel Prizes. It took like a century to undermine, most of the conventional wisdom about cancer. It's a fabulous book, by the way, just pure reading for your own like edification. But even in fields with experts, on top of experts, the people who really innovated in cancer were actually people sitting in the middle of Texas with no medical degrees.
But and actually, we know much more about the heart and cancer than we do about the brain. We don't have any idea. We generally know, not in your case, but generally know what's going wrong in our heart. But in the brain, we don't even know what causes depression and, growing like crazy. So that this problem is very acute.
One of the biggest things that is just really hard for people to understand, and it's like a concept I think a lot of people inside of medicine understand, but they're just really shitty at articulating, is kind of like your level of confidence or the level of evidence, right? Because like not all evidence is created equal. And there are certain things where it's like, we know this is true. We've run these like giant randomized studies. Here's the answer. And then,
We'll call
it
that
trickles down from
polio
there.
vaccine, for example. Like as an,
Right.
yeah.
Or like wash your hands before you do surgery, like things like this that, we didn't actually know back in the day. And then there are things where there's obviously materially less level of evidence simply because, A, we don't even understand how the disease, biologically works, or the treatments are very unclear. And I think humans do not understand this like spectrum of evidence where you can go, there are certain medical decisions where we literally have no fucking idea. And then there are ones where we have tons of confidence in, and we're really bad, especially in the news media, of articulating high confidence, mid confidence, low confidence. And that would be such a benefit to society if we could share a little bit more of that. For example, the number of articles that I get sent typically by my family members where they're like, hey, look at this new study, look at this new drug. And I go, hey, did you check if that study was done in a mouse? Just the first check, right? And it's like 95% of the time, it's like, yeah, it's a mouse. Like, just remind you that's not a person. And so even little things like that, like where was the study done? What kind of animal was it done in? Where, how many people? If there was a human study, these are complicated concepts. People just don't get them.
Well, if we're afforded the luxury of doing episode 3, I think healthcare is one that I would love to dive into with, Zach, given your background, Keith and Kevin, I think that could be a really fun one to talk about, because I think we touched on it a little bit last time between outcomes and the implications of cars and guns and opioids and all that. There's a lot of data to unpack. So I think we can maybe put a pin in it here. And if we're fortunate enough to do episode 3, circle back on healthcare.
That'd be great. I would love that.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Until next time. See ya.
Turpentine VC is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen and Econ 102. If you liked the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store or rate us on Spotify. Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at ericaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.